For centuries, ships traveling between Europe and Asia faced a punishing reality. There was no direct water route connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Indian Ocean. Every vessel carrying spices, silk, or passengers between these two worlds had to sail thousands of extra miles around the entire continent of Africa, a journey that could take months and claimed countless ships to storms, disease, and the sheer exhaustion of endless open ocean. This geographic barrier shaped the entire economics of global trade. Nations that controlled the long route around Africa held enormous advantages over rivals forced to accept slower, more expensive shipping. Merchants and mapmakers had long noticed something tantalizing on their charts. A narrow strip of desert in Egypt, barely 100 miles wide, was all that separated the Mediterranean from the Red Sea, and beyond it, the vast trading networks of Asia. The idea of cutting a canal through this narrow strip of sand was not new. Ancient rulers had attempted similar projects thousands of years earlier, connecting the Nile River to the Red Sea through a series of canals that had long since silted over and vanished into the desert. But a direct sea-level canal, one capable of carrying massive modern trading ships straight across the desert without locks or complicated engineering, remained something no civilization had ever successfully achieved. The man who would eventually turn this ancient dream into reality was not primarily an engineer at all, but a French diplomat with a personal fascination for Egypt that bordered on obsession. Having served in the region years earlier, he had grown captivated by the idea of a canal connecting the seas, studying old survey reports, and dreaming of a project that could reshape global trade while cementing his own place in history. For years, this idea remained little more than a private fixation, discussed with friends and occasionally sketched onto maps during quiet evenings. Political circumstances of the era made such an ambitious international project seem like pure fantasy, particularly given the complex web of competing interests among European powers, who each viewed Egypt as strategically vital to their own colonial and commercial ambitions. Everything changed when a personal connection placed him in an extraordinarily fortunate position. A childhood friend and former student of his ascended to power as the new ruler of Egypt, granting this determined diplomat unprecedented access to the very authority whose approval he would need to make his lifelong dream a physical reality. What had once seemed an impossible fantasy suddenly appeared, for the first time, genuinely achievable, provided he could navigate the treacherous political waters surrounding any project of this international magnitude. Securing formal permission to build the canal required navigating an extraordinarily complex diplomatic landscape. Egypt technically remained under the authority of the Ottoman Empire, whose rulers viewed any major foreign infrastructure project with deep suspicion, wary of European powers gaining permanent strategic footholds within their territories. The diplomats spent years cultivating relationships, negotiating concessions, and carefully managing the competing interests of Egyptian authorities, Ottoman officials, and skeptical European governments who each had their own reasons to support, oppose, or attempt to control any eventual canal project. British officials proved particularly resistant, concerned that a French-led canal would threaten their own maritime dominance and colonial interests throughout the region. Despite these formidable obstacles, sustained diplomatic pressure combined with genuine personal relationships eventually secured the necessary concessions. Egypt's ruler granted formal authorization for construction, along with rights to form an international company that would fund, build, and eventually operate the canal for a specified period before ownership would transfer to Egypt itself. This concession represented an enormous diplomatic triumph. Yet it also planted the seeds of future conflict as competing nations continued jockeying for influence over a project that promised to reshape global trade routes and international power dynamics for generations to come. With formal permission secured, the enormous practical challenge of actually excavating a canal across 100 miles of desert terrain finally began. Given the technological limitations of the era and the almost incomprehensible scale of earth that needed removal, project organizers turned to a controversial and ultimately notorious labor system. Forced conscription of Egyptian peasant laborers compelled to work on the canal through a traditional corvée system long used by Egyptian authorities for major infrastructure projects. Tens of thousands of men were pulled from their villages and farms, often with little notice and minimal compensation, forced to march into the unforgiving desert to dig a canal that offered them no direct personal benefit. Working with nothing more than hand tools, baskets, and sheer physical exhaustion, these laborers moved millions of cubic yards of sand and earth under a merciless desert sun, receiving wages that barely covered basic survival while working conditions that verged on genuine exploitation. Water, food, and basic medical care remained perpetually inadequate for the scale of workforce assembled in this remote desert location. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded worker camps, and the physical toll of manual excavation in extreme heat claimed lives daily. Deaths that received little acknowledgement from project leadership focused overwhelmingly on maintaining construction schedules and satisfying increasingly impatient international investors watching progress from thousands of miles away. Financing a project of this unprecedented international scale required assembling capital from investors across multiple nations, a task that proved nearly as challenging as the physical construction itself. The diplomat-turned-company founder traveled extensively throughout Europe, personally pitching his vision to potential shareholders, financial institutions, and skeptical government officials who remained uncertain whether such an ambitious desert excavation could ever actually succeed. The newly formed canal company sold shares to investors throughout France and other European nations, though, notably, British investors largely refused to participate, reflecting their government's continued political opposition to a canal that threatened British maritime interests throughout the region. This left the project disproportionately funded by French capital, creating financial vulnerabilities that would later cause significant complications as construction costs inevitably exceeded original optimistic projections. Despite these financial challenges, sufficient capital was eventually raised to begin serious construction, driven by genuine excitement about the canal's transformative potential, combined with aggressive promotional campaigns emphasizing the project's historic significance. Investors who purchased shares were essentially betting on an unprecedented gamble that human engineering could successfully carve a permanent, navigable waterway through 100 miles of shifting desert sand, a feat that many respected engineers throughout Europe continued to publicly doubt was even physically achievable using available technology of the era. As construction progressed deeper into the harsh Egyptian desert, workers faced environmental challenges that tested the very limits of human endurance. Temperatures regularly soared to punishing extremes, transforming simple manual labor into a genuine battle for survival against heat exhaustion, dehydration, and the relentless, grinding exhaustion of digging through sand and rock day after day without meaningful relief. Disease became an even deadlier adversary than the heat itself. Cholera epidemics swept repeatedly through overcrowded worker camps, spreading rapidly through contaminated water supplies and inadequate sanitation systems never designed to support the tens of thousands of laborers concentrated in this remote desert location. These outbreaks killed workers by the hundreds, sometimes forcing temporary halts to construction as entire worker camps became overwhelmed by illness and death. Medical care available to ordinary laborers remained rudimentary at best, entirely inadequate for addressing epidemics of this scale. Company officials, driven by financial pressures and construction deadlines, often prioritized maintaining excavation progress over adequately addressing the humanitarian crisis unfolding within worker camps. The true human cost of the canal's construction, measured in thousands of anonymous deaths from disease, heat, and sheer physical exhaustion, would remain a largely uncounted, unacknowledged toll hidden behind official narratives celebrating engineering triumph and international commercial achievement. Just as construction reached a critical phase, the project faced a devastating political crisis that threatened to end it entirely. Sustained diplomatic pressure, driven largely by British opposition to the canal, succeeded in convincing Ottoman authorities to formally condemn the use of forced conscripted labor, citing genuine humanitarian concerns about the corvée system's brutal working conditions and staggering human cost. This ruling arrived at a moment of maximum vulnerability for the project. Deprived overnight of the massive conscripted workforce that had powered construction thus far, company leadership faced an existential crisis. How could excavation possibly continue without the tens of thousands of forced laborers who had, however unjustly, provided the backbone of construction progress up to this point? This political intervention, while addressing legitimate humanitarian concerns about worker exploitation, simultaneously threatened to permanently halt a project that had already consumed enormous resources and years of dedicated effort. Company leadership scrambled desperately to develop alternative solutions, recognizing that survival of the entire venture now depended on finding an entirely different approach to construction, one that would need to rely far more heavily on mechanical innovation and voluntary paid labor, rather than the controversial forced conscription system that had defined the project's earliest years. Faced with the sudden loss of forced labor and the very real possibility of total project collapse, engineers turned toward mechanical innovation as the only viable path forward. This crisis, while devastating in the short term, ultimately accelerated the adoption of steam-powered dredging equipment and mechanical excavators far more extensively than originally planned. Technology that would prove dramatically more efficient than manual labor had ever been. Massive steam dredgers, specially designed and manufactured for this specific project, were deployed to excavate sections of the canal, particularly through waterlogged areas where manual digging proved especially difficult and dangerous. These machines could remove staggering quantities of sand and mud far faster than any comparable number of human laborers, fundamentally transforming the pace and methodology of construction across the remaining excavation. This shift toward mechanization represented a genuine turning point in the history of large-scale infrastructure construction, demonstrating that industrial machinery could accomplish tasks previously reliant entirely on massive human labor forces. Voluntary paid workers, now employed under considerably improved conditions compared to the previous forced labor system, worked alongside these mechanical marvels, forming crews that combined traditional physical labor with an unprecedented integration of industrial technology, ultimately proving both more humane and, remarkably, more efficient than the brutal system it had replaced. Even with mechanical innovation dramatically accelerating progress, the canal's construction continued facing significant technical and financial obstacles throughout its remaining years. Shifting desert sands proved remarkably unpredictable, occasionally collapsing back into freshly excavated sections during sudden windstorms, forcing crews to repeat work that had already consumed enormous time and resources. Construction costs continued spiraling well beyond original projections, straining the company's finances and testing the patience of increasingly nervous shareholders who had invested substantial capital based on now clearly over-optimistic initial estimates. Company leadership found themselves perpetually seeking additional funding, negotiating with reluctant banks and skeptical investors, while construction costs continued mounting far faster than anyone had originally anticipated. Beyond financial pressures, engineers faced ongoing technical puzzles unique to this unprecedented desert excavation project. Maintaining consistent water depth throughout the canal's considerable length required careful management of tidal variations between the Mediterranean and Red Sea, along with construction of connecting passages through several natural desert lakes that needed significant modification before they could safely accommodate the canal's designed shipping traffic. Each new obstacle demanded creative engineering solutions, gradually accumulating into a body of technical knowledge and problem-solving expertise that would ultimately prove invaluable for future large-scale infrastructure projects around the world. As the canal neared its final stages of construction, a renewed sense of urgency swept through the entire project. Years of setbacks, financial crises, and political complications had already delayed completion well beyond original optimistic timelines, and company leadership faced mounting pressure from shareholders and international observers eager to see this unprecedented engineering achievement finally realized. Remaining excavation work proceeded with intensified coordination between mechanical dredgers and voluntary labor crews, engineers pushing to connect the final disconnected sections of canal that still separated the Mediterranean from the Red Sea. Every remaining mile represented both genuine progress and continued challenges, as workers navigated the same unpredictable desert conditions that had plagued the project since its earliest excavation years. International attention intensified considerably as completion appeared genuinely within reach for the first time in the project's long, difficult history. Newspapers throughout Europe began regularly reporting on construction progress, transforming what had once seemed a wildly ambitious, possibly impossible venture into a genuine subject of international fascination. Diplomats, journalists, and curious travelers began planning visits to witness firsthand this remarkable transformation of Egyptian desert into a navigable waterway that promised to reshape global trade routes for generations to come. One of the most dramatic remaining challenges involved a series of naturally occurring salt lake basins along the canal's route, dry depressions in the desert that needed careful flooding and integration into the overall waterway system. Engineers approached this delicate process with considerable caution, understanding that improperly managing the flow of seawater into these basins could create serious complications for the canal's structural integrity and long-term navigability. When the moment finally arrived to allow Mediterranean waters to flow into these desert basins, engineers and workers watched with a mixture of anticipation and genuine anxiety, aware that this represented one of the final major technical milestones before the canal's complete connection. Water flowed steadily into what had been dry desert terrain for countless generations, gradually transforming barren depressions into navigable extensions of the growing waterway. With this crucial connection successfully achieved, only a final stretch of excavation remained before the Mediterranean and Red Sea would be joined for the first time in recorded history through a continuous, navigable, sea-level waterway. Workers and engineers alike understood they were approaching a moment of genuine historical significance, the culmination of over a decade of struggle, sacrifice, financial uncertainty, and stubborn determination that had, against seemingly impossible odds, brought this ancient dream to the very threshold of physical reality. When the final barrier of Earth finally gave way, allowing Mediterranean and Red Sea waters to merge for the first time in recorded human history, over a decade of struggle, sacrifice, and stubborn engineering determination had finally accomplished what countless previous generations had only dreamed possible. A continuous, navigable waterway now stretched across 100 miles of what had once been impassable desert. connecting two of the world's most significant maritime trade routes. The scale of human effort required to achieve this transformation remained almost incomprehensible. Tens of thousands of laborers, both forced and voluntary, had dug, hauled, and suffered through years of brutal desert conditions, disease, and exhausting manual labor. Steam-powered machinery, deployed following the crisis that had nearly ended the project entirely, had ultimately proven essential to completing excavation at a scale and pace human labor alone could never have achieved. Formal preparations began immediately for a grand international inauguration ceremony, one intended to mark not merely the completion of a canal, but the dawn of an entirely new era in global maritime trade. Dignitaries, engineers, and curious travelers from across Europe and beyond began making arrangements to witness firsthand what had, just years earlier, been dismissed by many respected engineers as a genuinely impossible undertaking. A sea-level waterway carved entirely by human hands and industrial ingenuity through the heart of the Egyptian desert, finally joining two seas that had remained separated since the beginning of recorded history. If this story of desert, disease, political sabotage, and sheer human determination moved you, that's exactly the kind of history we love telling here. If you enjoyed discovering what it truly took to connect two seas that had remained separated since the dawn of history, hit subscribe and stay with us, because there are many more incredible stories like this one still waiting to be told. See you in the next video.